It began like any other morning in the small, quiet town of Meizhou in Sichuan province. The air was thick with summer heat. The streets buzzed lazily with market-goers and the occasional scooter hum. But for one blind man named Jiang Qinqian that morning would unravel into something far darker. On August 7, 2014, during a routine police meeting, the phone rang. A call came in from an elderly man, his voice trembling, scattered. He reported something simple, yet deeply unsettling. His only son, a 22-year-old named Truong Xiu, hadn't come home in 2 days. It wasn't the first time the boy had wandered off. But this time, he had promised he'd return, and he didn't. The police took the case. At first glance it seemed ordinary. Maybe the boy got lost, maybe he was staying with friends. But then investigators noticed something strange. Xiu's phone was still in his room, his travel bag untouched. Inside it, 2,000 yuan in cash, women's watches, jewelry, items his father swore never belonged to the family. Just when the mystery deepened, a body turned up found face down at an abandoned stone quarry, bound at the wrists and ankles, his face swollen and blood dried into the rocks beneath him. The scene was brutal, but the story behind it was worse. At the center of it all was a son many in the village had written off, and a father who would eventually confess to the unimaginable. I can't help but wonder, what breaks inside a parent to make them do the very thing they swore to protect against? And what secret was this family hiding? So dark, so unbearable that the only way out was murder. It started with an ordinary lunch on August 5, 2014. That afternoon, Truong Xiu, 22 years old, unemployed, aimless, cooked a rare meal for his blind father, Jiang Qinqian, and his paralyzed mother, Tao Tai Puang. He chatted with his dad over rice and soup, laughing more than usual. He even asked his mother if she wanted anything special, an unusual gesture from a son who had never been particularly affectionate. He told them he'd be going to visit his uncle in the city of Nqitan that evening, and likely wouldn't return until the next morning. His father remembered it clearly. Xiu had promised to bring home a gift for his mother. He seemed happy, excited even. But something about that moment didn't sit right with Jiang Qinqian. His son had never been so attentive. And where had he gotten the money for food? Xiu hadn't held a job in years. Still wanting to support the rare display of responsibility, Jiang handed him a cloth travel bag and told him to pack a few things. Toothbrush, towel, a change of clothes. As fate would have it, that was the last time Jiang saw his son. At 5:30 p.m. that same day, Jiang returned from work guided by a neighbor as usual. His son was gone. The house was silent. He asked his wife what time Xiu had left, but she wasn't sure. She thought he might have slipped out while she was napping. Nothing seemed strange until Jiang called Xiu's phone. It rang from inside the house. On Xiu's bed lay the same cloth bag, still packed, still zipped. Inside 2,000 yuan in cash, 2 women's watches, and a pair of gold-colored chains. Jiang was confused and worried. The jewelry didn't belong to them. The money didn't either.
He assumed his son had stolen something.
Still, it wasn't until the next day that panic truly set in. Xiu still hadn't returned. Calls to friends turned up nothing. He never made it to his uncle's house in Nqitan. Neighbors searched the village fields, nearby roads. Nothing.
That's when Jiang called the police.
While the local officers were still piecing together their first theories, possibly a runaway, maybe foul play, a disturbing report came in from a nearby quarry barely 2 kilometers from Jiang's home. A worker had found a body.
August 7, 2014, 9:00 a.m. Police arrived at the scene.
The body was that of a young man bound with rope at the wrists and ankles. Mouth taped shut, his face showing signs of extensive bruising. Lying face up on a rock stained dark with dried blood, he wore a light jacket and a white button-down shirt tucked into slacks. On the ground nearby, a sharp-edged rock and a blood-stained shovel. The victim had no identification, but when officers noticed a long scar on his left arm, they thought of something Jiang had mentioned. Years ago, his son had suffered a burn that left a distinct mark. Jiang was brought to the scene. Unable to see, he had to rely on the officers' descriptions. When they mentioned the scar, his breath caught. He confirmed what police already feared. It was Truong Xiu, A forensic analysis would later determine that he had died 2 to 3 days prior, likely on the night of August 5th. Cause of death, multiple blunt force injuries, the most fatal, being a skull fracture that caused internal bleeding in the brain. Other wounds on the chest, hands, and face suggested he had been beaten extensively, but not killed instantly. But something else disturbed investigators. Despite the violent scene, there were no fingerprints on the murder weapon, no signs of struggle. Whoever did this had come prepared. Back at Siu's room, police found another clue. His old cell phone, still functional, contained a threatening message.
It read, "If you don't hand over the money and the jewelry, you'd better watch your back." The sender A contact saved as Big Brother Bang.
It was clear now. This wasn't just a random killing. Someone wanted something from Truong Siu. And whatever went wrong that day, it had been brewing long before the first blow was struck. The quarry where Truong Siu's body was found hadn't been in use for over 6 months. Its jagged cliffs and silence made it the perfect hiding place for a crime. But police believed whoever brought Siu there didn't just want to hide a body, they wanted to make a statement. The body had been arranged almost carefully. Legs straightened, arms bound tightly behind the back, the mouth sealed shut with duct tape. A large rock lay beside him, caked in dried blood, and nearby a shovel, blunt, worn, streaked with something that looked too obviously like dried red paint. But it wasn't paint. A later forensic test would confirm it was Siu's blood. Forensic investigators pieced together what they could. The fatal blow had struck his temple, likely from the rock. Other bruises suggested repeated strikes to the torso and arms, perhaps out of rage or intimidation. The killer or killers had used gloves. No fingerprints, no hair, no clear footprints. The only visible prints in the gravel were too smudged, too overlapped to trace.
One officer described the scene as controlled, chaos, intentional violence, but carefully covered up.
Meanwhile, the mystery of the threatening text weighed heavily on investigators. The message had come from a number saved in Siu's phone as Big Brother Bang, a street-style name typical of someone trying to assert power. The message accused Siu of withholding money and jewelry.
Could it have been a robbery gone wrong, or worse, a betrayal among friends?
Detectives tracked the phone number. Unfortunately, the number hadn't been registered to a real identity. No address, no subscriber data, a burner phone, dead end.
But instead of giving up, the investigators decided to get creative.
A plainclothes officer posed as a rival gangster and called the number, claiming he wanted to talk business. The trap worked. The man on the other end, angry, impulsive, picked up. He barked threats, unaware he was speaking to police. He agreed to a meeting spot. The next day, detectives arrested the man known as Big Brother Bang. His real name, Don Tu Quang, 25, from Nin Ha Village, a neighboring community just minutes away from the crime scene. Quang was brought in for questioning. He didn't flinch when police showed him Siu's phone, or the text, or the bloodied bag found in Siu's room.
Instead, he shrugged, then smirked. "He stole from us," he said. "He got what he deserved."
That's when the investigation took a darker turn. Quang revealed that he and Siu had been part of a small gang, 4 young men, all from neighboring villages. Their specialty, burglary, targeting homes of wealthier locals. On August 4th, just a day before Siu vanished, the group had pulled off a major heist. But instead of sharing the loot equally, 2,000 yuan, some jewelry, a few expensive watches, Siu kept the goods to himself. He thought we wouldn't find out, Quang told investigators, but we always find out. When asked directly if he murdered Siu, Quang denied it. He claimed he'd been at home all week. His parents, his sister, they all confirmed his alibi. But police weren't convinced. Was he lying, or were his family protecting him? The real puzzle, though, wasn't just who did it, but why the body had been left in such a theatrical, almost ritualistic state.
And why did it feel like this wasn't just about stolen goods?
Police now had one suspect, but they were beginning to see that Siu's death wasn't a random act of revenge. There were more people involved, and one of them, it turned out, wasn't a gang member at all.
As police dug deeper into Truong Siu's social circle, a pattern started to emerge, one that disturbed even seasoned investigators. Xiu had surrounded himself with a group of 4 young men, all unemployed, all directionless, and all with a reputation for trouble. They were regular visitors at the Jiang household, lounging around the house for hours. Blind or not, Jiang Qinqian had sensed something toxic in them. Their names, as given by Jiang, were Hung Sun, Lam Tin Gia Hao, and Qiu Bang. But when police ran these names through local registries, nothing came up. They weren't real names, aliases, fake identities. People don't hide their names unless they're hiding something else too. The only concrete lead police had was Qiu Bang, who turned out to be the same Doan Tu Quang they had just arrested. The other 3, Jia Hao Hung Sun and Lam Tin, disappeared without a trace. No one in the villages seemed to know who they really were or pretended not to.
But the walls were closing in on someone else. Through interviews with neighbors, one name kept resurfacing: Vuong Tri Te. Vuong, a former convict with a history of violence, had a daughter named Vuong Tang Tue. 6 months earlier, Truong Xiu had allegedly attempted to assault her. Though the incident never resulted in formal charges, the trauma had been real. Tang Tu required psychological counseling, and Vuong Tri Te had made it clear to anyone who would listen, if he ever saw Truong Xiu again, there would be blood. Police visited Vuong's home. At first, he denied everything, claimed he knew nothing about Xiu's death. But when pressed, his story cracked.
Vuong finally admitted that on August 5th, the day Xiu disappeared, he had gone to the old quarry to collect stone for construction. There he claimed to have witnessed a beating in progress, a group of men surrounding one young man. Vuong recognized the victim immediately, Truong Xiu.
And yet, he didn't intervene. Why? I thought he was just getting what he deserved, he said quietly. I figured maybe someone else had a daughter he hurt.
That comment made investigators freeze.
It suggested something far worse than gang retribution. It hinted at another victim and another motive. And then a second suspect surfaced. Vuong identified one of the men at the quarry that day as Tran Hung Kai, a local hardware store owner with no known connection to Xiu's gang activity. He wasn't on any list of suspects. He wasn't even on the police radar. Officers rushed to Kai's home. He wasn't there. They searched the property, and in the shed behind the house they found a shovel stained with dark red streaks. A blood test confirmed it matched the DNA of Truong Xiu. The net tightened. 2 days later, Tran Hung Kai was arrested while attempting to flee to another province. With him was another man, Truong Tran Quan, a friend of his and occasional work partner. Under interrogation, both men eventually confessed they had been at the quarry. They had helped tie Xiu down. They had hit him. They had killed him. But something was off. When detectives questioned them separately, their stories didn't line up. One said it was revenge, the other said it was a warning. Neither could explain who gave the order or why.
There was a third man at the scene, according to Vuong's original eyewitness account. But Kai and Quan insisted it was just them. Then came the most unexpected twist of all.
On the morning of August 12th, a taxi pulled up to the local police station. Out stepped Jiang Qinqian, escorted by his neighbor Li Qian An. Jiang was shaking, tear-streaked, trembling. I need to tell you something, he said. Tran Hung Kai and Truong Tran Quan, they're innocent. I'm the one who killed my son.
Stunned silence.
He repeated it firmer this time. Truong Xiu wasn't my son. Not anymore. He asked for no leniency, offered no excuse. He simply asked to be heard.
What followed Jiang Qinqian's confession wasn't a dramatic outburst. It wasn't fueled by emotion or some impulsive breakdown. It was calm, deliberate, like something he had been preparing to say for a very long time.
I killed Truong Xiu, he told police, because the boy that used to be my son no longer existed. In the interrogation room, the blind father sat still as stone, recounting everything in painful detail. How Xiu, once a bright-eyed child, had become consumed by violence, obsession, and rage. How he had dropped out of school, stolen from his own family, assaulted villagers, and eventually done something that shattered everything. Xiu had assaulted his own mother. Jiang's wife, Tao Tai Puang, had been bedridden for a year after an accident. Paralyzed from the waist down, she depended on her husband for nearly everything. And yet one day, while Jiang was at work, Xiu had climbed into bed with her. At first, she thought it was affection. a rare show of comfort from a son who had become so cold. But then she felt his hand,
And she screamed.
but he silenced her, and he didn't stop. She kept that secret for weeks, out of shame, out of fear, out of some impossible hope that it would never happen again. But it did. The truth finally came out when Jiang returned home one night to hear his wife sobbing in pain. She couldn't keep it in anymore. She told him every word. Jiang didn't believe it at first. He didn't want to, but deep down something had already been broken. He started watching Xue more closely, noticed how he ignored chores, berated his mother, demanded money, and boasted about the things he'd stolen with his gang. The boy was unrecognizable, and yet he was still Jiang's son, or so he thought.
The final breaking point came after a drunken evening with two close friends, Tran Hung Kai and Truong Tran Quan. Jiang, shattered and desperate, confessed to them what had been happening inside his home, how his son had turned violent,
How he'd attacked the only person left who still believed in him. The three men sat in silence, until someone no one remembered exactly who said it. "What if we ended it?"
The plan was simple. Xue believed he was going to meet a girl, a setup orchestrated by Jiang, who knew his son's weaknesses. Instead, they took him to the quarry. They tied him down. They silenced him. And together they beat him until the screaming stopped.
At trial, all three men stood before the court. Jiang Qinqian, aged blind gaunt, Tran Hung Kai and Truong Tran Quan, visibly broken.
Their lawyers pleaded for mercy, citing provocation, mental anguish, and the years of unchecked trauma in the home.
But the court couldn't ignore the facts.
This was a premeditated killing.
There had been time to change their minds, time to seek help, time to do almost anything else.
In the end, Jiang Qinqian was sentenced to life in prison for premeditated murder. Tran Hung Kai and Truong Tran Quan were each sentenced to 15 years for their role in the killing. As the verdict was read, Jiang didn't flinch. He simply bowed his head. Some in the courtroom wept, others applauded, and somewhere perhaps a small part of him felt free. The news spread quickly, not just across Meizhou or Sichuan, but across all of China. The headlines were impossible to ignore. Blind father murders son after discovering incestuous abuse. A village in silence. What happens when protection becomes punishment? Public reaction was immediate and polarizing.
Some were horrified. No matter what the son did, one Weibo user wrote, "You can't just take justice into your own hands. We are a society of laws." Others, however, viewed Jiang Qinqian's act not as one of murder, but of mercy.
In hushed tones and crowded online forums, people asked, "What would I have done if I were in his shoes? A blind man, a paralyzed wife, a son who had become a danger to everyone he touched. Was it justice or a desperate kind of salvation?" I can't help but think about that quiet lunch on August 5th when Jiang still believed maybe that his son could change. That moment when Truong Xue smiled and promised to bring a gift home for his mother. Was it guilt manipulation, or was there deep down a part of him still trying to be the boy his parents once believed in? The deeper tragedy isn't just that Jiang killed his son. It's that along the way, so many signs were missed, ignored, or dismissed. The school that expelled him but offered no intervention. The community that whispered about his behavior but said nothing. The mother who stayed silent, hoping to protect the image of the boy she once knew.
And maybe the most haunting question of all, could this have been prevented?
In the end, this wasn't the story of a single crime. It was the slow collapse of a family trapped in isolation, disability, and silence.
There are no easy villains here, and no clean heroes either.
Jiang Qinqian will live the rest of his days behind bars, not because he didn't love his son, but because he couldn't save him. And as for Tao Tai Fuang, the woman at the center of it all, she never gave an interview, never released a statement. But according to the neighbor who helped escort Jiang to the police station, she had only one quiet request before he left. "Please, tell them my son used to be kind." That line has stayed with me, because it reminds us even the worst monsters were once someone's child. Some people say that monsters are born, others say they're made. But what if they're raised slowly, unknowingly, by love that turns into indulgence, by fear that turns into silence? And when justice, morality, and despair all blur into one, Who gets to decide what's right?
Let us know in the comments below. And if this case stayed with you like it did with us, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more true crime stories that dig deeper than headlines.
Thank you for watching. Stay safe, stay kind, and stay curious.